Hey everyone, I'm Luke Teschler, here with Shomik Ghosh, and you're listening to 35 Milla, a podcast about film. This is episode 2, The Batman.
We're back at it again here in March in New York City. Survived Omicron.
We did, and we survived Memoria as
Very
well.
true. Very true.
Who starts a film review podcast with a movie that nobody has seen or can see? So a quite bold move, but we made it through, and here we are now with The Batman.
The Batman, a complex film. I think we both liked it, but obviously have our thoughts about everything involving it. We both got to see it in New York over the last 2 weekends. I saw it in IMAX. It was a visual spectacle for sure. Luke, you want to lead us into a little bit of summary? You can get moving from there.
Sure. I think it's important to kind of set the stage a little bit for this movie, given Batman's long history, both in the comic books and in the film universe. It's important to know that this story is what Matt Reeves, the director, has called a year 2 Batman. So that means is it's basically Batman very early in his career as Batman, trying to figure out the lay of the land in Gotham and his role in Gotham as the Batman and as a superhero. So knowing that, it's interesting because the movie really sounds largely in noir, detective, crime genres, right? It's really a crime movie at its core with Batman as the chief detective, which I think is really cool, and I think they execute it relatively well. But it's a relatively new spin on the character. It's a relatively new spin on Batman. So the movie really unfolds based on this central mystery of corruption, where the Riddler,
played by Paul Dano,
he's incredible. We'll get to him in a bit. It's a great performance. But the Riddler is unveiling corruption throughout Gotham through a series of riddles, and the Batman is solving them as he goes. As each person is murdered, a new riddle pops up, and the idea is that these riddles collectively unveil the larger political machine that has been dominating corruption and crime in Gotham. So that's the center, that's the nugget of the story, that's the brainchild of the entire take on Batman in this film, and I think it worked pretty well.
Yeah, I agree. And, it's really, the film is anchored, I think, by a series of strong performances. I think there's a lot of consternation about Robert Pattinson being cast for the role. But I think one of the incredible things about the Nolan Batman was if you look at the cast, it's real heavy hitters. You're talking about Christian Bale, Morgan Freeman, Michael Caine in these, roles that really anchor the film. And I think that gave it a significant heft. And I think here again, there's a lot of good performances. I think Pattinson has turned out to be one of the best leading men of this era, which you would not have guessed.
He's so underrated. It's really a crime that people saw him in Twilight and just couldn't see past it.
It's the Twilight effect.
Because he's been great. He's worked with a lot of very accomplished directors
and
over the last
he's made those choices to put himself into complex, difficult films. Good Time is one of my favorites.
It's a great movie.
The Lighthouse is, again, very strange, but he's quite good in it. Even, I think he did Cosmopolis,
of course,
which was very good.
With David Cronenberg. Yeah. He's done High Life with Claire Denis. These are really sophisticated filmmakers, right, who are working honestly on the outside of the mainstream largely. So he's made a lot of very interesting choices. I think working with those people and telling the stories he's told in those movies helped him develop as an actor for sure.
Totally.
So I was excited to see him anchor this, and that's exactly what he does.
It's a great performance. It's a good performance. And then he's supported by Zoe Kravitz, who plays Catwoman. I think an improvement on the Anne Hathaway character. I think a lot more complexity. She's actually also a dynamic actress. I thought that was a good casting choice, actually,
and great chemistry with Pattinson,
absolutely. And then you finally have, putting aside Paul Dano, who we'll talk about more. I think Colin Farrell in, a phenomenal role. I think in a scene-stealing role. It's unbelievable it's him.
He disappears. You can't even notice him. I knew it was him, and I couldn't see him while I was watching the movie.
I really couldn't see it, but I found myself in those first scenes where you meet him. He's villainous and charismatic and
funny.
Colin Farrell is a great actor in general. The Lobster, I think, is like fantastic. A profound, and even The Killing of a Sacred Deer, he's really good in it. But this I thought was awesome. And then finally, Paul Dano, the ultimate creepy guy. If you've seen Prisoners, that's where Paul Dano, I think,
shines.
Yeah, and this is a Riddler that I almost can see coming from that trailer in Prisoners where, maybe he abducted the kids. You can see how he's molded this character off of that. It's very effective. And what I liked is generally I didn't think that there was too much over the top villainy. I mean, the Joker and the Dark Knight is what it is, but
Sure.
This was, I think, relatively restrained actually in some ways. So, the way we usually approach this, we give our short thoughts first, we'll then get into scores, and then we'll talk about the different categories. So, Luke, what was your takeaway from the film?
Sure. Let's start with, I think it's a very enjoyable, and I think it's a very well-made movie. I think that it has its own style, and the style shines throughout the entire 3 hours.
Yep.
We'll talk about the runtime in a little bit, but it's incredibly stylistic. I think that it's the most comic booky of all the Batmans I've seen. It really does feel like a very good adaptation of a comic book. The neon lights, the dark streets, a lot of wet streets, a lot of rain in Gotham in this movie.
A lot of rain.
And speaking of Gotham, I will say that I think Gotham is incredible in this movie. The setting is fantastic. You 100% believe they're in this city that's, plagued by crime, massive wealth inequality, and it really becomes almost a character in the movie in a way that hasn't really been the case in prior Batman films. So he brings a distinct vision to Batman. There's no doubt about it. I think it falls short of some of the peak Nolan movies, and I do think that there are some flaws in the film that we'll talk about. But overall, I think it's a very enjoyable effort. And I think it's a well-made movie, and I liked it. I liked it a lot.
Yeah. I agree with a lot of what you said. I suspect that a lot of this we will be aligned on. But, my general view is I actually think the jury is out for me on what this film means. When I saw Batman Begins, I thought it was excellent. But, at that point, I didn't know there was going to be that sequel. And when you watch Batman Begins again now, it's a foundationally very important film to the broader arc of the Nolan trilogy. And I was thinking when I left the theater, I'm interested in how this will play out because, as we'll discuss, there were parts of this that felt small ball to me. The plot, the Riddler's antics, kind of a lot of it felt, you're right, it's a detective story, but whereas the existential threat that Gotham faced in the Nolan trilogy was so omnipresent, here it does feel more contained. This is a crime-ridden city. There's corruption. These are kind of more basic threats. But if this is the jumping point where both Batman and the Riddler grow up, we would expect the Penguin to begin to make a transformation. And this is the opening film, like the Fellowship of the Ring a bit. Then I could see this being a great foundational opening. So I thought it was enjoyable. For its runtime, it kept me more engaged than a lot of 3-hour movies would. Flawed, but I think as good an effort since Nolan. I think it's right up there. So that was my thought. My score for it is going to be pretty high for myself. I think I'm going to go with a 7.6, which I think is reflective of the filmmaking. I think I was very impressed with. I really thought the performances were good. The story was not that ambitious, but I thought well executed for the most part. And like I said, it sets up a sequel, if they're going to have one, really well. Now you know the characters, you know their growth, you know where they are. The Riddler, not to give too many spoilers away, but by the end, it looks like he's about to get his own apprenticeship in Arkham.
Of course. There's no spoiler. This isn't really a spoiler at this point, given that the movie's been out in a while. But at the end of the movie, Paul Dano as the Riddler meets a cellmate who is,
probably
slides to be the Joker.
Probably
in
the
subsequent
Joker.
movies. So in terms of score, I think that's a good score, 7.6. I'm going to give it a little bit of a lower score at 7.2, but I think in the sevens is where this movie should fall.
Right.
And I think we'll get into some of the flaws, but I think the reason I ding it a little bit, maybe more than you, is because that foundational point you're making about the fact that this is kind of opening doors for other movies kind of detracts from the story in this film,
Sure,
I think.
absolutely.
I think they spend a lot of time setting up the Penguin. They set up the Joker. They set up a lot of things that are surely going to expand this universe. And HBO Max stories and future movies.
Yeah, they've greenlit a Penguin series. Yeah.
For sure. And that's cool. But I think when you're coming in at a 3-hour runtime and you're dedicating so much time to setting up those alternative universes, the narrative underlying this specific film is going to suffer a little bit, and it does in certain ways. So that's why I ding it a little bit more than a 7.
I think that's very valid. We'll talk about it as we go through this, but I think this also sits contra opposite to something like Dune, where it's the same exact function, but there's a complexity to this film. You're not viewing it as, part one. You're viewing it as its own independent film, and partially that's because Denis Villeneuve didn't know if he was going to get to make Dune 2.
Part 2.
Whereas here, they know this is a cash cow. They know this is going to be the beginning of a Star Wars-like iterations, Mandalorian, etc. They're going to do that here. So I think they could take the long
We're going to be watching Matt Reeves Batman for a decade,
exactly.
right? That's where it's going.
And to be
fair, it's fine. It's good enough.
The box office was great.
Sure.
This was like a really successful box office run post the pandemic. So, with that, 7.2 for Luke, 7.6 for me. We're going to go through the categories. To start, we always ask the first question: what worked, and what was the movie? Did you think it was trying to say?
So, I think the things that work best are the things that I highlighted in the beginning, right? Which is that the style is impeccable.
Awesome.
It's incredibly well directed. He's got a great knack for just being a visual storyteller, right?
Absolutely.
It feels like a comic book movie. There's a lot. I think there's some odes to Hitchcock in there.
Yeah.
Like the movie opens up with somebody looking through binoculars.
Looking
through binoculars. It's got very rear window type of vibe.
Absolutely.
So he's a competent filmmaker. He knows film history. He knows the story he wants to tell, and he uses all of the visual and sonic tools at his disposal to tell a very good story. So in terms of the technical proficiency and just the prettiness of the movie, high level.
Agreed.
It's great.
I think the aesthetic value is really great. And one thing that I liked, and you had this point when you were talking about your central summary, the Nolan trilogy has to be the benchmark. I mean, they made this movie after a film trilogy series that redefined the genre. I think it was nominated, at least some of the performances. It really broke through in a new way we haven't seen with the superhero film. So it is the benchmark, and when you're making a new Batman, that's what you're judged on. But I will say the Nolan depiction of Gotham kind of was all over the place. You had in the first Batman Begins, it's like kind of comic-y in almost a goofy way. The Ra's al Ghul, it's like green air is popping out. It's all that. And then the second one is Chicago, basically.
I was going to say, I basically felt like Gotham was just a major U.S. city, like New York or Chicago. It wasn't anything particularly, unique or creative aesthetically or kind of cinematically.
He did the Michael Mann Heat view, like that urbanism, and the edgy, cool color. He had a blue hue on it. And then the third one is, I think, a continuation of that. Here, what I liked about this Gotham, to your point about the style, it's very foreboding. It 100%. Has a darkness.
It's a character. It's a character in the movie.
It has a darkness, and you kind of get that sense of decay. And I like that they're showing the Batman. What his role is not even well defined because the city itself is breaking down. And despite him being there, he's asking, like, am I doing any good? Because the city feels so kind of dark and violent. What did you think about the people, like the bad guys in the subway having paint on their face, or the robbery with the onion?
I was just going to say, I'm so glad you brought that up, because that's exactly where I think the movie excels at its highest, right? The world building of Gotham's impeccable, right? Because in the Nolan movies, the crime was always kind of abstract, right? It's like, okay, crime's happening, but it's happening, on the L in Chicago, and it's a robbery, right? Right. But what you have here is you really have commitment to executing the vision of the comics, right? You have the drop head with the onion thing, and it's just so specific and real and creepy, right? And then you have the face painting of the gang, and obviously that guy only has one side of his face painted because he needs to kill somebody to fulfill his membership and get the full face paint. So there's that level of detail and specificity and visual storytelling that's very cool.
And willingness to blend. Nolan's were so hyper realistic. Right. I think Christopher Nolan said, I'm going to take a normal city and put two arguably insane people in it, right? And this was much more like, this is a different world than we live in. It's a little bit, the parameters are a little different. And I think that worked, and I was thrilled to see it. And I think, to your point, that aesthetic let the movie be 3 hours, but it was kind of visually interesting. The scenes where they're sitting atop of Manhattan, was what the view was, and they're talking, or the club environments. The
club scenes are great.
It's great. It just had a great look to it. So I agree completely.
I would also say, I think the realism point is a very good one, Shomik, because there's no doubt that the Nolan movies redefined what you can do with Batman and kind of set the stage for these new movies by making it way more realistic, right? Like I've rewatched some of the 90s movies and they're just cartoony.
Yeah, I mean,
you know, so it's very important, I think, that Reeves in this case follows Nolan in the sense that he makes it realistic and grounded, but not so much so that he can't play in the funniness and the artistic just fountainhead of creativity from the comics, right? He toes the line perfectly. Like, you never feel like you're watching a cartoon or something slapsticky like Jim Carrey's The Riddler. No. But at the same point, you don't feel like you're in your own American city, right? He toes the balance very well. And I think that's one of the best things of the movie. Like, in lesser hands, nobody could have executed that tone and that style and that visual framework to tell the entire story.
And this is a quick aside, but a separate point is, I every time I see these movies, that I will say, the influence of Blade Runner on the depiction of the future urban environment, that I got a lot of Blade Runner original when you're looking at Times Square. That kind of zoomed out, dark dystopian, that mix of, it's like steampunk a little bit. The look, it's actually interestingly mixed because there are moments of hyper-realism and moments of that. But all in all, I thought that was a highlight. And I think it needed to be that because otherwise, it would feel like, what are we doing here? I mean,
we just saw this.
We just saw this. But this is a world builder. It was well done. I mean,
love the Blade Runner call out.
Yeah.
And I think as we go through the podcast, there are going to be a number of movies that this movie pulls from and its influences. So that's a great point. Also, I think a lot of Michael Mann. He's told a lot. You mentioned it earlier, right? Yeah. But he's the king of wet streets, right? Yeah. Like cars driving down wet streets and chase scenes and urban crime, right?
Collateral. Collateral is one of those movies that you see that same commitment to the darkness almost. So I thought that worked.
And Ed Hopper, even the Hopper paintings, the Nighthawk paintings when Riddler's in the he's pulling from a lot of really cool imagery and visual tradition. Yep. And there's no doubt he's an incredibly talented filmmaker. And you feel comfortable and you feel like you're in the hands of an expert in that respect throughout the entire 3 hours. Other than the style, let's talk about the detective story piece a little bit, because I think this gets a little bit tricky. I think this is why the movie excels, but also one of the flaws I have with the film is that it gets 75% of the way there, but not 100% of the way there, right? I think it's very cool that they use Batman to tell a gritty noir crime story, because I love crime stories. We talked about Prisoners. I mean, there's a reason why I think mysteries are the best types of films, right? Because there's a lot of suspense, there's a lot of tension. Yep. You're figuring it out as it happens, right? And in that respect, it's cool, and the overall big picture detective story about unveiling crime and corruption in Gotham is cool, and I like that slant to it, but as we'll talk about when we get to the next category, there are some parts where I think they could have executed that a little bit better. But what did you think about the detective story in terms of one of the strengths of the film?
I will say, until we have kind of discussed this, I hadn't really conceptualized it in that detective motif, but that's exactly what it is. And it's interesting that in this one, way more. See, in the Nolan films, Batman he's kind of got this incredible resources at his hands. He's got Lucius Fox, who can do all sorts of sequencing. I mean, there's that apocryphal scene where they reconstruct the bullet to get the Joker's finger. It's absurd and it doesn't make any sense.
And then the Patriot Act influenced recording of all Gotham citizens.
So that one was basically in that one, Batman was a separate police department. It was like the privatization of the security obligation to this one person. And there's been actually social critiques written about the Nolan series about what it says is the answer to our problems, hyper wealthy individuals who can take on that function. Is that the right message? And obviously it gets even more complicated in the third one, where you have someone like Bane who emerges and has his own vision for populism.
With the Occupy Wall Street type of
But instead you need a really wealthy, privileged guy to save the city. In this one, Batman is basically a member of the Gotham Police Department because Gordon keeps bringing him to crime scenes. And I loved that. I thought that was awesome. This concept that Batman, obviously, I was thinking in my head, where they're going to show Bruce Wayne is a criminologist. He has great insights. He's seeing things differently. But it's within the sphere of the Gotham Police Department. There weren't too many. You remember, the jurisdictional thing, that was a callback. There was like, oh, well, the club isn't,
Sure.
we need a warrant to get in there.
Right.
I think that's a complete callback to Lau in Dark Knight, where they send Batman to Hong Kong because they can't get there. So that was similar, but for the most part, I thought it was much more of a detective. That's a really good way to put it. And I liked that. And I thought that the concept, like you're saying, of putting Batman on the hunt with the police department and each step along the way they're solving it is really good. The issue I have, and we're in the what works category generally, but to preview what didn't work is, I just think it wasn't a particularly interesting resolution to it all.
Right.
I mean, I think you create a detective story. The good detective stories are really intriguing as to what the final answer is. Prisoners is a good example of a movie that kind of, it felt like a callback to, but I loved putting Batman in that role. And he's like, the best. He's like the Russ Cole of the Gotham Police Department.
Yeah,
he's got a little bit of that extra.
I love that you pointed it out because there's not a lot of comedy in this movie, but there are a couple laughs.
Yeah.
Between the interaction of Batman and the Gotham PD, right?
Yeah.
There's like a chain of custody joke.
Yeah,
and there's,
right.
there are a couple of funny moments, and I agree that the intermingling of them is a really cool and, again, strong part of the film. We'll talk again about the weak parts that you just pointed out when we get to the next section. But let's talk about the acting, because I think the acting, again, we're in what we liked about the movie, we're in the strengths, and I think across the board the performances were great.
Are very good.
Farrell, we talked about, he's
Loved
absolutely unrecognizable. I wish the Penguin had a bigger role in the movie because I could eat him up all day. Like, I could eat up those scenes all day. He's not really, he's such a bit part.
By the time you leave the movie, he's still a mobster.
Yeah.
He's not even a villain yet.
No.
So clearly,
and he's not really related at all to the central mystery. He's a red herring, basically. His entire role in the movie is a red herring, right? They think he's the rat, and he's not, and okay.
Right, that's true.
It,
I thought he actually has no real relevance except for
he's going to take over Gotham.
Yeah,
he's basically at the end of the movie looking down on a besieged city, and clearly he's going to. It's almost his origin story to a degree, but not a particularly interesting one.
No,
so it's like, okay, what are you really doing in this movie? Which again, we're kind of shitting on the movie a little bit in the strong parts. We'll get to all this, but I do think the acting, Farrell's disappears.
Phenomenal.
Kravitz is great.
Kravitz is very good, dynamic, edgy, believably conflicted in between her own lineage and her obligations. I never loved the Catwoman because that's a callback to The Dark Knight Rises, right? I mean, Anne Hathaway's character in The Dark Knight Rises, she has like a roommate who she really wants to take care of. Same exact thing. So that was a lot of overlap in a way that I never loved that whole plot as the motivating reason for Selina Kyle. But I thought, for example, Pattinson and Kravitz's charisma and their connection was phenomenal.
Yeah.
So like that scene when she's wearing his eyeball cameras and they're talking, very good. That was fun. That was imaginative. It was a really nice vehicle to create some ratchet up, some suspense. He has one goal. He wants to identify the corrupt members of the Gotham police and DA's office. She wants to learn about other stuff. And then all of a sudden she has a connection to mobsters that he didn't know about. I thought they were really quite good.
Yeah.
And what I would say is, I wasn't sure if they were going to make the romantic interest stick. I actually would have been okay if they didn't and like they left it there. I mean, they obviously have a kiss, but unlike The Dark Knight Rises where Catwoman, they end up together, etc. This was, I thought, kind of an interesting pairing of much more a crime-fighting duo than anything else.
Yeah, definitely. They're bonded both between the chemistry, but the shared goals of eradicating these people at the centerpiece of the crime story. She's great. I hear you. I think also as a director, when you screen test those two and you just see the chemistry, so it's hard to just be like, there's going to be nothing between them.
You've seen them on the interview circuit. They've been very flirty. It's been over the top, but I think it worked. It worked well 100%. For the film, and I think it will continue to work if they both play kind of big roles. I think the final person to talk about is Dano. And I think what was good about his role is that there is a menace to the Riddler, an unhinged quality. Again, everything is hard to do after Heath Ledger's Joker. It's not a easy performance. And I think it stands probably below both Heath Ledger's Joker as well as Joaquin Phoenix's Joker. Mm-hmm. But again, those two films were vehicles for that character. I mean, I think Christopher Nolan says The Dark Knight is actually not about Batman. It's about the Joker.
100%.
Dark Knight Rises.
And the Joker obviously is,
reclaims the Batman story. With all that being said, I thought Dano was good. I would have liked more of him not as the Riddler, because he himself is a very compelling actor. Mm-hmm. We got him mostly with the mask and the glasses and the voice and like the film clippings and all of that.
The only scene you really get him as Dano is at the end, and it seems incredible. He's great when he's in jail, but you're absolutely right. I would go one degree further. It's not even that he's the Riddler, but in a lot of scenes, you're looking at the Riddler on a screen through the movie screen. You're watching a video of the Riddler almost. So he's not even there in person in the scene. He's being represented through a simulacrum of himself, right? And it's a credit to Dano's performance that he's so good that you can be watching him on a screen inside of the screen and still be engrossed. But I totally agree. I would have loved to see more of him, both as Paul Dano, like the person, and also just
the Riddler doing stuff. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I totally agree. So, I think we've previewed a bit of what we didn't think worked. I mean, these things oftentimes are tied together. I mean,
one other thing, Shomik, I want to say about what did work is, we've talked about the visual storytelling in terms of setting up Gotham, but also some of the action scenes in this film are just great. Like you talked about the club scene with the eyeballs, like that scene's fantastic. The scene where they're fighting underground and like they're shooting and just the muzzle light of the gun is lighting up and you're getting almost like a strobe light effect. Incredible. So the action scenes in the movie are also impeccably done, which is obviously, if you're going to make a Batman movie post Nolan, you need to nail the action, and Reeves does.
Yeah, and one thing that I thought about, to your point, and this might kick up some people's ire, but one of the things I have the hardest time with the Marvel movies is every battle is like 7 minutes long. It's like every battle is end of the world battle. And you have like 12 of them in the movie and they're just preposterous. It's like every single time. And it tries both the credibility of it, but also you get exhausted. I thought there was a lot of discrete fighting scenes that didn't go on too long, that moved quickly enough that you were kind of, yes, this is the kind of what I expect from a superhero film, but it was I think the word is, it was like disciplined. It felt like purposeful in the plot as opposed to just like, oh, look at how much action I can
A lot of times it was secondary to the narrative. It wasn't the driving force of the narrative, except for maybe the chase, the Batmobile chase scene. But every Batman, you need to have one.
Well, that's what that was actually probably my least favorite scene in the movie. Because I was just like, this is so played out.
Yeah.
These chases.
He's doing it for the fans at that point, which I respect.
I respect it, exactly. And I don't think you'll ever have a better chase scene, maybe since the French Connection, than in The Dark Knight when the Joker, the truck flips over in the middle of Michigan Avenue in Chicago. The Joker comes out, Gordon. Yeah. I mean, that's like such an epic scene. I almost think it's a fool's errand to call back into that. I think you do something different. But all in all, the action sequences were well choreographed, and I was a little worried based on the way Pattinson was walking around in some of the early scenes that the suit was very clunky. I don't know if you noticed that, but he was credibly physical. His physicality was more, but he's a slight guy.
Well, this was a big issue. Yeah. I don't know if you remember this, but basically when he was cast, I guess in an interview, he made a statement like, I don't plan on working out or something. And like people flipped out. Yeah. They're like, don't give me any fucking scrawny Batman. Yeah. Like, this guy better hit the weights,
But, I mean, which is hysterical. It's an incredible bulletproof suit that he has. I mean, he survives a lot of shots.
And he's great in the movie. He's lean, but like he's not, he's not a slob. Like there's that scene that I feel like, again, Reeves felt like he needed to put in where it's just following Pattinson putting a shirt on and he's flexing his back muscles. Like,
because like the Bruce Wayne Batman was muscular.
Was huge. Yeah. It's not like that, but he's not like he's credibly a fine fighting strong guy.
The other the Batman series needs to one day conquer is I just cannot believe someone who saw that Batman and Robert Pattinson wouldn't put it together. Even and like Christian Bale at least is not so distinctive in his chin, but like Robert Pattinson has like a distinctive bottom quarter of his face.
I was gonna say they had to. I feel like they almost had to adjust the suit to fit that dude's jaw.
There are people who are like seeing them the day after, like Marconi, like he sees him, and it's like you're not gonna put this together at all. Yeah, but anyway, I mean, this is the things you suspend a little disbelief.
Sure.
So look, we've touched on what didn't work. I think both of us felt it was a long movie. And I think it could have probably cut 20, 25 minutes. I mean, my biggest problem, and I'll tee this up here, but I think this is going to be something we're both going to talk about, is I felt it was a little bit small ball, the underlying corruption that they were revealing. I expected something more than what they did. They built it up so much. This is the corruption at the root of all evil. This rat who helped the DA's office it's going to change your world. And instead, the end conclusion was like, well, the police department's corrupt, the prosecutors are corrupt, and the underworld runs the city. I mean, maybe because we've been watching Batman films now forever, that seems like a given. I mean, It doesn't feel like this massive underplot. And when you commit to a detective story, the mystery needs to be really good. And if it's not, then when you come out of it, I think you kind of feel, what was the payout here? And when it's 3 hours long, I think the viewer I felt a little bit like underwhelmed by that story. And I do think, and my view is the third part where he floods the seawalls. I really hate when a feature or a phenomena occurs that's not been teed up. I didn't even know Gotham had seawalls. And all of a sudden he's flying. I mean, it makes no sense. Well, things like, what do you like? It came out of nowhere. I was expecting him to reveal one final thing, maybe like Bruce Wayne is corrupted, or maybe the Batman has killed something like that would really be shaking. And instead it's like, oh no, I blew up some seawalls and I have gunmen at Madison Square Garden who are going to shoot people when they're trying to take refuge. It was like, I mean, so random, so out of the blue, not a very fun or exciting. It's like a Dwayne Johnson film. It's like, San Andreas Part 2. It's like, who wants to talk about natural disasters in that? So I thought that was you could cut that, have created a better final act for the Riddler and Batman, one final, like what Joker did, right? When he gets caught, he puts Maggie Gyllenhaal and Aaron Eckhart's character.
Forces them to choose.
That's like a very good moral quandary. None of that was there. And so I think they could have cut it by 30 minutes probably. And separately, I think they could have probably written a better... I think the initial buildup of the crimes was good, but they needed to have one final boom problem that instead they opted out with the weirdest, to me, like final challenge. It's like, can you basically save a flooding city? I just didn't love it.
So I have similar complaints, and I think taking them in order with the length, you're absolutely right. If you're going to make a 3-hour movie, like, you need to do your best to trim that movie such that everything in it is virtually essential.
How many great 3-hour movies are there? I mean,
Lord of the Rings, not many, definitely not comic book 3-hour movies, right? So it's like, you need to be strategic about your choices. And in this movie alone, I think there are maybe 3 like video montages with just Nirvana playing in the background where like nothing's happening. You just get shots of the city and Nirvana, which is like, listen, I'm a Nirvana fan. I get the fact that this is like Kurt Cobain Batman. I get the concept, but you do it once and we got it, man. Like we don't need 3 montages like that, right? So there's definitely some excess that could be cut to make the movie shorter. And in terms of the mystery, 100% agree. I think this is almost similar to Tenet, the Tenet problem, right? Where if you step back from the movie and you think about everything, it makes sense. Like, oh yeah, okay, they're moving through time, forward and backwards, and they're going to meet each other. Okay, he's unveiling crime one step at a time through these murders in Gotham to unveil larger corruption. It makes sense from a big picture standpoint, but when you're in the scenes by scenes, the scene by scene logic doesn't always feel like it adds up in a way that's, rewarding. So I share that concern. I had the same exact response to it. And small ball is a funny way of putting it, because at the end of the day, I mean, it's not really small ball if you're rating $1 billion grant for an orphanage for crime that has retarded the development of your city, right? Like that's a big issue, but you're absolutely right that the mystery feels small because, and I think this is the big issue, you don't see a lot of it. No. You're told a lot of it, right? So it's just, in that sense, the storytelling feels a little bit flat. Like the big reveal about Thomas Wayne's father, for example, that he had a connection with Falcone and that they were involved in that reporter's death, you see again from a Riddler monologue on a screen in the movie, right? So you're just basically being exposition dumped the entire one of the biggest twists or one of the biggest parts of the mystery in the film, right? So in that sense, I think the storytelling falls flat a little bit. There's not a lot of, it's very hard to tell a good mystery story, and I appreciate the effort here, but that aspect of the storytelling didn't always land. It didn't land.
It didn't work. And I think, one thing I want to say too is the only way that I think this, maybe the Matt Reeves year 2 Batman concept didn't work is foundational to Batman is the Wayne family's murder, the impact it has on Bruce's lionization of his father.
Right.
That creates the impetus for why is he doing this. Now, we get dropped in, he's already been doing it for some unknown time. You assume
2 years, I guess, right? Like, is what I guess you're supposed to assume.
And that's fine, but when the revelation about his father comes out, it doesn't have any impact. I didn't feel like horrified or shocked because you don't have any actual relationship in this film with the character of his father.
Or Bruce Wayne. There's really no Bruce Wayne in the movie.
You're just basically like, okay, I mean, and to be frank, I kind of saw it coming as the way they were leading up to it.
Sure.
I also thought that basically you're absolutely right that Bruce has no role in this. And ultimately, there needs to be something that the main protagonist has to overcome within himself in order for a story to really pay out. And I don't know if Batman grows at all in this film. I thought about it. It's like, the one of the real rewards of the Nolan film is there's a lot of actually heavy existential ethics that are at play there. What's one man's role in a broader system?
Sure.
The personal sacrifices people try to do good undertake. The constant battle between nihilism and purpose, like having a purposeful life. Like Bruce is at some point he wants to hang up. I want to have my own comforts. I'm a wealthy guy. Let me just date Rachel and like that constant...
Be a playboy and just run Gotham.
Right,
basically.
that constant push and pull and the character's evolution. Here, you don't get any of that.
No.
Instead, you're kind of like, for whatever amorphous reason, Robert Pattinson is really committed into fighting crime. They don't tell you the origin story. They assume you know it, which most people do.
Sure.
And it just, there was no character growth beyond that they're solving a mystery. And I think the worst thing is Reeves wanted character growth because remember he has the journals, like the self-narrating journal entries, where it's like I can be
which
better.
Again is just straight up telling, not showing. I'm going to read a voiceover here about my internal thoughts.
It didn't make sense. I mean, my view is that lets the film down. I think that's why it's a 7 because everything else was strong. And I think the first 3/4 to me were very, very good. I think I texted you when I was watching, like, oh, this is phenomenal.
Right.
The last sequence to me, was the disappointment of not a better payoff, and then I hated the seawalls.
Yeah, the seawalls. The whole Madison Square Garden part of the movie is definitely the weakest part of the film.
It doesn't make sense. Yeah, it's like, why would you even
It's
put that
the weakest
in there?
part of the film because also you kind of pull from contemporary January 6th, like radicalization of people on social media.
Yeah.
It gets a little bit too close to reality.
But let me also ask this, though.
But,
what is the Riddler's, so Riddler has been motivated in his prior behaviors to really call out the people he thinks who has sold Gotham upstream.
Sure.
And flooding Gotham, there's a very subtle, but I think incongruous shift in the Riddler's motivations in the film, where for the first 3/4, he's a very focused, he's like basically a KPMG, as they use
forensic accountant. Sure, yeah.
And then all of a sudden, he's just this nihilist, kill everyone terrorist. That is very disharmonious because he's been targeting. And you can almost get this little bit of the Zoe Kravitz monologue where she suggested maybe these people deserve to be punished.
Right.
But now the end sequence is like, well, let's just let it all burn. That to me felt like very cheap.
I totally agree. And basically, I think what happens is in the third act, you basically get the Jokerification of the Riddler, right? It's like he goes from being the Riddler to just the Joker, whose chaos prevails and just burn this all down, which is not consistent with
in the story.
Right. Or the big picture motivations. Like if you wanted to do that, why didn't you just kill all these people? Why would you even...
Yeah.
And I think the reaction is... or the would-be reaction is that the Riddler needed Batman to execute his plot. So he strung Batman along in order to actually kill Falcone because the Riddler couldn't do it himself, which I don't really buy. I don't believe that. He's killing all these other people. He didn't really need Batman. Yeah. It's just the construct of the story. But I totally agree with you on the Riddler. I mean, he's a forensic accountant. He's doing the accounting for this orphanage. He realizes all the corruption. He wants to expose it. But then where do you go from wanting to expose it to just burning down the entire city? I mean, his plot at the end is basically to kill
everyone.
The savior, the person who pledges to correct all of
and
this.
They haven't shown her being corrupt.
Not at all. I mean, I guess you need to assume that the Riddler is so far gone that he has no hope. That Gotham is an unsalvageable place. But again, that's not. I mean, I don't know the comics well enough to know if that's the Riddler or not. But that definitely is the Joker. So basically, the Riddler is just becoming the Joker, right?
Or Ra's al Ghul. The corruption is endemic.
But basically, the point is that the moral code of that villain is different than the moral code that you would presume the Riddler has, given his character trajectory over the course of the first 2/3 of the movie.
I think that's exactly the issue. You put it well. If he wanted to destroy everything, he wouldn't have had such a targeted, focused goal of exposing corruption. You would just burn it all down.
It makes no sense.
And there was not a triggering event that maybe made him realize that his corruption purge wasn't working, and
he needed to just burn it all down.
There was none of that
because you don't see a lot of the Riddler on screen, too.
And you could imagine a great scene might be like in the opening scenes, he reports the corruption and gets himself punished for it. Yeah. That can create...
Or it just gets stuck up in red tape and nobody does anything.
Exactly.
Sure.
That can create that visceral, I need to go outside the system. But that discongruity to me really... Because look, it's better to end strong and start bad than to start strong and end bad.
Yeah, although it is very hard to do good endings. Yeah, it's just hard.
That's another thing in the Nolan films. I mean, they were well packaged. They closed out nicely. And I think this is where... But... Let me now zoom out, though, to talk about that plot. If, though, this was meant to show JV Baby Riddler, this is the first foray of the Riddler. If the next movie shows a far more developed, manic, insane Riddler who can really begin to ratchet up the threat, this movie, in context, maybe does look like that it's a year 2 Batman, it's a year 1 Riddler.
Right.
Now let's see them in 5 years when Riddler's in Arkham with the Joker in his ear.
Well, you're absolutely right. And that's why what we talked about earlier about how the movie is largely in many ways a setup, right? And it wouldn't surprise me if the Riddler and the Joker join forces, and basically they are just both versions of the Joker at that point.
Because there is, there's always this sense that the big criminals in this universe start doing petty shit. Is this the first of, if that's how they reconceptualize it, the Riddler, he killed some people, he sent him away, and then he comes back as this, absurd villain, then I can see this as an origin story for the Riddler. He failed. Because remember, he says, I failed everything, and then the Joker says, you had a good try.
Right.
That, to me, was salvaging some of this, because I was like, okay, well, they're kind of hinting at, it was underwhelming. But it's his opening salvo to chaos.
Yeah, I think that probably is where they're going, and it makes sense.
That would make,
as a result, the movie kind of feels unfinished, right? Exactly. Or just not exactly rewarding. I do want to go back to the Batman character development point, though, because I both agree and disagree. I agree that it wasn't well felt, but I don't necessarily agree that it wasn't there, or that Reeves didn't try to put it there. And I think that largely, he goes throughout the movie as vengeance, not Batman, right? So clearly, year 2 Batman is motivated by vengeance, right? He wants to get revenge for his family being killed, and he wants vengeance on all these people who think that they're above the law and they can commit these crimes unpunished, right? And I think at the end of the movie, basically what happens when in the Madison Square Garden scene is, he neutralizes that threat, and they pull up his mask and they ask him, who are you? And the guy, the criminal, the Riddler follower, says, vengeance. And immediately after that, Batman basically, jumps into the water and then saves all these people, and he's parting the Red Sea with his beacon.
With his beacon.
So clearly, I think in that scene, he's meant to realize, my current approach is not working. Right? I need to be a force greater than vengeance, right? I cannot be a strictly retribution-based person because that's not working. And in fact, it's doing worse because I'm now radicalizing these other vigilantes who are saying they're now vengeance, who are doing what they can to solve the problem. So I think in that scene, there's a pivot where he needs to kind of reframe the goal of Batman or the persona of Batman. I just don't necessarily think it's that fleshed out. I think it's there. It's just like, okay, it doesn't really hit heavily, to me at least.
Yeah, because
but I think it's there. I think he's trying.
Because it would have been great if they wanted to show that. What would have been great is if they showed him being far more capricious in his initial actions.
I think that's fair too.
Because he was committed to just action. He's protecting innocent people. If instead he was just going around beating the living shit out of the mob guys and picking them off, then I would understand if he's saying, like, look, I've been very selfish in my quest for justice. There's a bigger city that's suffering. And this movie is that change from self. Because in the Dark Knight trilogy, Bruce is not... Once he becomes Batman, he's committed to unraveling the dark corruption and protecting people. But Bruce is harmful. He's in Nepal stealing stuff. Right. I would have loved if they'd shown him being very capricious, violent, and then realizing my pain is shared by a broader group of people. I'm equipped with the privilege I have to protect them. That makes sense to me. Here, from the beginning, he was doing altruistic shit.
Yeah.
I mean, he's protecting people in the subways.
For sure.
He's,
the logic of it doesn't really make sense.
But I get what your point is.
Payoff doesn't make sense. I just think as a concept, the idea of having the arc be early Batman vengeance-based to now a pivot makes sense, and it's cool, and I respect him for trying to do that. It just, again, only gets like 75% of the way there.
Totally
for me,
agreed.
Which is why it's, in the
totally
low
agreed.
sevens, not
exactly. I think they tried and did well. So, I think we've discussed a lot of what worked and what didn't work. I think the final thing I would say is, in the end, this is a broader issue with movies in general. They're part of a broader organism. They're clearly setting the Penguin up. That's been greenlit by HBO Max for its own series. What this does is it makes the films not be able to stand on its own as much as it could be. So, I'm open to looking at this film again in 5 years to see how it stands up. I think one of the things I said earlier is Dune, I think, did a very good job of building a story, having enough intricacy within it, and having enough character development within it that you get yourself to a point where you're rooting for the character, you're understanding the stakes, and then it sets you up where you're like, okay, I cannot wait for the next one. Here, I am excited for the next one because I liked the world that they constructed. It was a pleasurable experience, but I do feel like they they pushed too much of it away. I want to see more Riddler, more Penguin, get that stories going. So you actually feel like I'm getting the meat and potatoes.
Yeah, 100% agree. And I think Dune is a good pivot point to compare this movie to, because in Dune, you're absolutely right that you feel the character development. Yep. There's that scene with Chalamet and Rebecca Ferguson in the tent where he's he realizes what the future of his life is going to be, and he says you did this to me, to his mom, and I'm getting emotional in the theater watching. I was these are real characters who are feeling real things, and you don't get any of that in the Batman, which again is fine. It's a comic book movie. It's the source material isn't as developed as a novel,
as a Frank Herbert.
So I get all of that, but I think that Reeves was pretty close, and I think if he made some choices and kind of did a little bit more work and was more disciplined in cutting out some of the excess, he probably could have got pretty close to that, which for a comic book movie would have been remarkably impressive.
And what I'll also say is Reeves the screenplay, it's the plot. He did as well as he could. He made a very visually gripping film. He cut it well. The acting performances were great. But these are the broader things, and leaves me appreciating the Nolan films. Because they were the first to do it, and they had huge ambition, and they pulled it off. Yeah. And they landed it. So, who would you recommend this film to? I think for a big box office film like this question is a little bit less salient than some of the more weird films we will do in the future, and we have done with the Moria. For me, I think it's it's anyone who's interested in the comic world.
Is it basically everyone except the people who watch and like Memoria. Like, effectively,
right.
Like, if you do the Venn diagram,
there's no middle. There's no middle.
Like, that's effectively it, right? It's like the whole left side of the diagram.
Yeah, this is a classic big box office, and I'll say it's a nice return to form for the franchise. I mean, the Ben Affleck Batmans. I mean, those are terrible. The Joker, that's a separate film, but like I liked it. I thought it was good, but very, 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 very narrowly focused on like a very singular plot. So I thought this was a nice tie-in, and I think people who like the Nolan trilogy, I don't think will hate this. I think it is its own film.
I think they'll like it. I think they'll like it a lot.
I don't think they'll feel like, I'm watching a cheap knockoff. I think it's a different story. Clearly, it's polished.
Different aesthetic.
Yeah, exactly.
But same level of filmmaking. Same type of action scenes, right?
So Luke, our third category is, so what's one way that you would make the movie better? Like, what's your number one way to fix it?
Number one way is I would shorten it. I would cut out some of the stuff about the Penguin. I would cut out some of the excessive Nirvana montages that are unnecessary. I would definitely tighten up, if not change the third act. And I think what I would do in place of all that is do more work to show the underlying character development, or show at least the underlying mystery. Yeah. Right? One of those two things for sure needs to be better developed. And I don't know if I think that's more of a screenwriting issue than a directing. I mean, it's hand in hand, but I think basically you need to add some scenes in the script that kind of make the mystery a little bit more compelling. And one thing I would say is that, in the Nolan movie, there are goosebump moments, right? Yeah. And I feel like this movie lacked a lot of that. Yeah. There are cool scenes, but I never felt goosebumps. I never felt like the tension was ratcheted up to an 11, which you need to have to really be a good movie.
I agree. The one way that I would really, if I could fix it, is I would step back, give the Riddler a bigger story. Give me the story of why the Riddler is so focused, and then tie everything that happens from that original sin. Yeah, as that's your building block, basically. Make it, because when you anchor it and you know what the bad guy is motivated by, and then like you said, you create a detective thriller. Sure. Then that story follows and it tracks. But when it's kind of amorphous, then the detective is also kind of chasing a ghost, and it leaves you kind of underwhelmed. And I think they got close, but that's where I would fix it.
It's a great point, and two responses to that. One is you could definitely get away with that because, as we've talked about, there's not a lot of Bruce Wayne. No. So it's not like you need to do a lot of Bruce Wayne development. He's not in the movie. You just keep it just Batman.
Tell us why the Riddler cares about this.
And develop Batman based off the relationships with the Riddler when Riddler's on screen. I think is an easy way to fix that.
That's the end of today's episode. As always, thanks for watching 35 Milla. Please like, subscribe, and tune in for more. Hope to see you soon.